next session, which is co-hosted by an organization that we have collaborated with intensively, a very good organization based here in New York. James Cocaine is the head of the organization, and he will tell you just very briefly about the organization.
Thank you very much, Peter. As Peter said, my name is James Cocaine. I'm director of the New York office of the Center on Global Counterterrorism Cooperation. You can understand with a surname like Cocaine, you need to be rather cautious in a room full of people like this. We were hoping, not for that reason, but we were hoping that the director of the centre, Alistair Miller, would be here to make this introduction. Alistair founded the centre along with one of our panellists, Eric Rosand, before Eric went back into the Department of State a few years ago. Alistair's on his way back right now from Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, where he has been working on preparations for a meeting we are doing in November with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and also with the UN, again with another panellist here, Richard Barrett, on countering terrorist narrative on the internet. This is fairly typical of the kind of work that we do at the centre. Like ICSR, we try to be, where we can, an incubator of ideas, a force multiplier, in particular for the United Nations and other multilateral organisations, and a service provider, a capacity builder. I won't say much more, except to say that I think this is an excellent example of the kind of cooperation that we're going to be talking about in this panel. We all know that the terrorist threat is not one that any state or any community can meet alone, given the globalised nature of the threat today. Cooperation is obviously a necessary condition for success. We hope in future to work with many of you on issues we're addressing today, such as the internet, as I mentioned, ransoms, the role of civil society, regional organisations, the role of the United Nations, and the relationship between terrorism and organised crime. It's our pleasure to present this panel to you today. I'll hand the panel back now to Peter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you. So indeed, the topic we will be discussing for the next 50 minutes is counterterrorism cooperation. We're moving on seamlessly in many ways. If indeed it is true that threats are becoming more transnational, that because of globalization, the internet, cheap flights, low costs of information, terrorist networks can expand globally. Clearly, that requires more cooperation between nation states. Is that working, and what challenges do exist in that field? And we have assembled an excellent panel to try to answer this question, consisting of Richard Barrett on my immediate right, the head of the UN's Al-Qaeda Taliban monitoring team. To the right of him, Bill Patterson, the Australian ambassador for counterterrorism, Eric Rosand, senior advisor for multilateral engagement at the Office of the Coordinator for Counterterrorism at the State Department, and then Dr. August Hanning, a veteran of international counterterrorism cooperation. He was, until last year, the State Secretary of the Interior with overall responsibility in Germany for counterterrorism, and is also a former president of the BND, the Federal Intelligence Agency in Germany. So let me begin by asking the question of the panel, inviting you to give brief responses. Counterterrorism cooperation, is it working? Ambassador Patterson.
Well, thank you, Peter. Yes, I think it is working. Certainly, from my own country's point of view, we were plunged into it, in essence, by having Australian victims in the World Trade Center bombings and pretty much every international bombing since. But let me just say that cooperation requires willing partners. And early on in this decade, I think some of our partners, particularly in some Muslim majority states, were in denial that they had a problem or constructed conspiracy theories about this and were sensitive to working with Western partners. But after 9/11 and after the Bali bombings, I think the debate was cast in rather stark and confrontational terms. And our beginning with Indonesia, for instance, which has been the centrepiece of our cooperation, was also not particularly propitious. After so many Australian victims were found to have been killed in the Bali bombings, there was a sense of outrage in Australia which led to us imposing and demanding a joint investigation with our Indonesian partners. But the success of that has built policing into a major component in our bilateral relationship. And from Indonesia's part, the capacity development that they've had there has enabled them to investigate, prosecute, convict over 400 terrorists in full public view, remembering that Indonesia is now a very active democracy with a very active media, and this has moved Indonesia away from conspiracy themes to a realisation that it had a domestically generated terrorist problem. That's, I think, a good example of the distance we've come, and I'm happy if members of the audience are interested to talk about components of that problem as we go through, but perhaps I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Bill. Eric, Bill was saying it was, it is working much better now, but it was hard to build it. Is that also your experience from an American perspective?
I think that's right. I think we, after 9/11, we sort of ran into this rather blindly and didn't quite appreciate the challenges in getting our partners or countries who want to be our partners to make terrorism a priority in their own country, or countering terrorism a priority. But I think we've seen great progress, as Ambassador Patterson was saying. If you look at Indonesia as sort of the gold star of, in many ways, of both a country sort of developing the political will over time, but also external partners cooperating very closely with that country, whether it's Japan, the US, or Australia, to provide them the capacity to, when it's mixed with the right political will, you get a lot of progress. And we've seen this in other areas too, whether it's with the Philippines, in East Africa, in the Sahel, to varying degrees of success. I think in addition to the political will challenge that Ambassador Patterson mentioned, which is quite significant in many places still. I mean, Indonesia is a good example of where they've managed to build that will, but other countries have been less advanced, shall we say. And this creates challenges in terms of capacity building, because I don't think there's a lack of resources now to provide capacity to countries that are interested in using them and strengthening their own abilities. But again, it's the political will challenge. But I think one of the bigger challenges now, or an equally a great challenge now, is we've seen lots of progress on law enforcement cooperation, criminal justice cooperation, border control cooperation, military, of course, and intelligence cooperation. But as we move further away from 9/11 and more people become aware that sort of the harder side of the shorter term challenges are dwarfed by the longer term challenges of violent extremism, I don't think international cooperation has sort of developed in that longer term area. And I think we're all struggling, both governments and multilateral organizations, to figure out what international cooperation in dealing with these longer term challenges, the upstream factors, as our Deputy National Security Advisor calls them, what is that cooperation going to look like? And I think this is certainly an area where organizations like my former one and Peter's organization can really add value in helping us think through these challenges. So,
thank you, Eric. Dr. Hanning, as I said at the beginning, you've been involved for a long time in security intelligence. How have you seen international cooperation on counterterrorism evolving over those years?